Your work is very well known for museums primarily. For instance, the Kunstmuseum in Basel, the new upcoming museum in Cologne, Wallraf Richartz Museum, and the Swiss National Museum in Zurich. Today we want to focus on the Lindt Chocolate Center in Zurich. Could you argue that this is a kind of museum? Or where would you situate the project within the context of your amazing museum work?
I think in a certain way the Lindt Chocolate Center is a museum, or perhaps even more a museum than others, since it is it's not necessarily a public place, but it's for sure a civic space in the sense it is open, it's accessible, and there's something at display. And in that sense, I see it as a possible variation of the museum as a type. If we look at the program of that project, which we are currently working on, or which is under construction, we even see that there are traditional elements of a museum, like an exhibition. But there is other things that I find as much interesting as perhaps the traditional display. It's a place of production. It's kind of a place of experimentation. They are experimenting with new types of chocolates, and you can see that. And so the question, to what extent is the museum, or can the museum also be a place of production, is an interesting question.
Maybe you could, since you referred to these different types of functions in the museum, say something how these different programs are reflected in the organization of the building.
Yeah.
Because I guess there's a more public part in the lobby with exhibition, production, and maybe some hidden parts.
Yes, in the end there is not so much hidden. The building is a very simple and in a way a primary type. It's an atrium building. It's a box with a big atrium in the center. And what we try to do, understanding that there's very many different types of activities going on, also by the way changing over time, such as auditoriums, museum, as we said, production, offices also, meeting places, a club, a place where you would make chocolate yourself, a shop, and so on, cafe. We try to conceive the building with a certain robustness and flexibility towards that. And the simple idea is to have a big void in the center that is sort of arranging or organizing all the different activities around itself. And that's how we try to tackle the quite interesting and also a bit difficult problem of combining so many different activities. In that sense, I wouldn't say it's a specific type, it's a very general type.
What's very specific though is the geometry, because when you say box, it's probably true, but it's also a bit misleading in the way that this is a very circular geometry. That's quite an interesting thing to see the columns intersecting with the ceiling lights in a circular shape. Also, there's the kind of lobby or entrance situation as a quarter circle.
It's a form of an animated box, perhaps. So the box is not the complete truth. It's one aspect. Since the building sits on a factory site, we found it important to belong to that logic of the place, to the history and the urban structure of that place, which is factory buildings, warehouses. So yes, it's a box. It's a beautiful brick building in red brick. And then on one corner, the building sort of reacts or is animated with a quarter circle, a face of white bricks that opens a beautiful entrance to that box. And then you enter it, you find yourself in the atrium. But true again, it is not just a very regular set of columns or walls, but rather a sort of a composition of 8 monumental columns, which are stairs, lifts, all sort of tubes in a way that are serving the building. And in that sense, the atrium is the most animated place. And all of a sudden, the boring box starts to dance, starts to move. Machinery, movement is happening in a way within the architecture itself.
I mean, there's an interesting tension between, let's say, the regularity, the orthogonality of this box, and then the kind of the curvilinear nature of like what you actually encounter when you're inside this atrium. It itself is not a circle, but yet all of the, or most of the elements inside have this very, I mean, they have no corners at all. So I wonder, I mean, is this kind of geometric kind of tension between the round and the orthogonal? Is this kind of where you see this animation coming from?
Yes, or let's say this is the outcome of a whole set of thoughts, and I would relate this contrast or the combination of two systems: the orthogonal, rectangular logic of the box, and then the atrium with the circular columns and the circular stairs and all that. I would relate it, as I said, to the two systems of the urban site on the one hand, and then the movement, sort of the public, the people moving through the building on the other. So that's like one combination. Another one is that the expression of the building to the outside is brick. So there's laid bricks, there's a module, so it refers to one expression, and then the interior is concrete. So this is cast material. It has a different logic, also a different logic of finding its form. So in the sense, the circles or the tubes are a means to express also the physical quality of the structure itself, of the concrete.
And regarding the exterior facade, you mentioned it's a brick facade. Maybe you can say something about the material strategy of the exterior. Is this a reference to industrial architecture or early industrial architecture?
Yes, it is a reference, a very clear reference also even to the site and to some buildings on that site. It is the first site of Lindt and Sprüngli, where they started to produce chocolate more than 100 years ago, and it's still producing there. So there are some old buildings and not so old ones. Actually, one very beautiful one from the 1940s, I guess, which has a similar kind of tone of bricks. And what we did, we tried also to not just imitate or continue what's already there. We tried to give it its own expression by using a red brick, and also the joint, so the material between the bricks is exactly the same color as the brick. So there is an interesting moment of abstraction also that comes with that box. Yes, it is an analogous building in the sense that it makes reference to the history of industrial architecture, but at the same time, it also tries to stand out as something that has a sort of an artistic reinterpretation of it.
Yes, I mean, despite the monochrome nature of this red facade, the way that it's detailed gives it texture, right? I mean, there's an overlaying of bricks. It's not just a flat wall. Is that correct?
It is partly flat, and then there is something like a frieze or an element that runs around the building, which has to do with composition. You know, there are windows, and how do we relate these things? In that sense, it's an industrial box, but almost classically composed, and therefore the different treatment of bricks is part of that composition. Yes, absolutely.
Even the name Lindt and Sprüngli on this white facade,
glazed brick facade,
which I think is probably taking up some of the reference of your earlier work or of the Kunstmuseum, where there's a lot of, or usually a bit of text on the facade. Here, I guess also these the names Lindt and Sprüngli are also basically transformed bricks.
In the end, it will be a gilded elements or letters that are sitting on that frieze, and it will also it will be called slightly different. It will be Lindt, home of chocolate, or something like that. But anyway, it's an interesting question. How do you brand the building? How do you give it a name, and not just as a conceptual or as a question of communications, but as a physical architectural problem? How do you put letters on top of a building, and how do they find their place?
Yeah, it's difficult because very often in architecture, buildings are designed without the brand,
And then-
it comes as an afterthought, and
Exactly.
architects fight against it.
And-
So
and-
you're trying to, I guess, to include it very early.
We try to include it without making it the protagonist of the whole building, because I think it is, in the first place, it's about the structure of a facade. It's about combining the different, or binding together the different faces of the building. But still, yes, in the end, it is also a place where you brand, where you give a name, and the whole building has a lot to do with branding, with communications and all
But
that.
is this a,
Yeah.
sorry, is this a result of the fact that this is a commercial client, whereas with your museum buildings, that's more with public institutions?
Yes, I think from the moment on that the building has a content that is there to be shown to the public, the architecture must start to communicate in a very particular, specific way. A building has to be able to show, and let's say, typically, like maybe the place we're sitting in here, a building can be seemingly open, which is not very true, but it is transparent to a certain extent. So you can see what happens inside. That's one way. Another way is that the building is rather closed for practical reasons, perhaps also for reasons because we think it could be interesting that you just see a glimpse, so you get a sense, there are small windows, you guess, but you have to find out. But then the building has to communicate with other means. And traditionally, you would have had allegories, you have all sorts of ornament that would speak about the content. Nowadays, this is a bit different. And I think, to a certain extent, text, or perhaps even more immediate means like materiality, could help to guide the visitor and to understand what's happening. Yeah.
You mentioned that the site is actually the place where the Lindt and Sprungli production of chocolate started. Where do you see your building now in what could be called the production chain of chocolate? It seems as if this center is almost like an extension of the final phase of the production. It's a kind of museum. It's not just a chocolate bar you buy in the shop. You know, it's almost like a kind of transition between production and the delivery to the public. So it's almost, this is where I tend to think that this is where architecture actually comes into the game, and where a kind of musification maybe of chocolate happens.
I think your reading is at least to a certain extent very true. It is like the next level. Traditionally has always been a place where chocolate was produced, so it's the factory. It sits on the side of that site. We found it extremely important that in the first place the building belongs to that factory. That when you are coming to that place, you're going to the chocolate factory. I think this is like the excitement. But of course, when you then go inside the building, you find, strangely, the very end of the production chain. You buy chocolate, you taste chocolate, everything is there, and architecture is somehow trying to enhance this experience. And we were making a strange speculation, let's say, on a rather metaphorical level, that we said probably then the people going into that chocolate factory, which is not really the factory anymore, but still go into our box, they start to make a movement, circle up on the stairs, walking along a gangway, disappearing in a part of a display, coming out again, observing a production chain, following that production chain, going on the bridge, down, you becoming yourself kind of processed in the building. And the architecture, we were speaking about circles, we were speaking about soft movements, are maybe also recalling a moment of that sort of chocolate production. And in that sense, back to your question, Nicolas, yes, architecture is like an enhancer, or probably even an interpreter of something that is not really visible, and is trying to make it an experience, which in the end is always a spatial experience. It's a very kind of essential thing. No?
Yeah. It reminded me in a maybe funny way of a building that maybe almost 20 years was built in Dresden. It's called in German Gläserne Manufaktur. It's a factory by Volkswagen. And the idea was basically it's a place of production, and you get your key, and you take the car and run and drive down a ramp and drive home. But of course, the reality was that basically just very few screws were mounted there on the cars, yeah, because the real production was in Wolfsburg or wherever. So it was really a kind of dislocated end of the production chain. And from what I understand here, it's a bit different. So this is all in one area.
It's like both, you know. As I said, you basically get the final product, and you're told the nice story that comes with the final product. So that's at the very end. At the same time, you see authentic production or a part of it, because Lindt und Sprüngli took the decision, which I think is very good. If I try to imagine I'm a visitor, that their research and development activities are also partly in that building. So you not only experience the very end of the outcome, but you also see at least the very beginning of that whole production chain. And I think this is interesting and adds an important additional layer to it. Mm.
You mentioned that Lindt und Sprüngli, they've been this factory, this original factory where you're creating this site, is about 100 years old, right?
Yes.
This, I mean, maybe it's an intentional reference, but I mean, your contribution to the 2016 Venice Biennale, it was very simple. It just had a projection on the wall. It said more than 100 years, and so I wonder. I mean, there was a book as well, right? I wonder if you could speak about, in general, how you see this question of longevity with buildings, but then also specifically with this project. You already spoke about how the space is flexible inside, but do you see this building standing 100 years from now?
In a way, yes, I think. Yeah. But this is that doesn't mean that I necessarily believe it will stand for that whole period of time. But I think, ideally, we think of buildings that last. Not always. I mean, there is fantastic temporary architecture, but I think in a building like this one, given also all the effort of resources that are bound in such a construction, I think it should have a time horizon that is more than our generations.
Yeah, because 100 is kind of a unique number. It's very few people will ever live throughout that. So, you know, in architecture, I feel like the time frame, it's not just with planned obsolescence, but, you know, where we may think that a building will last, you know, 30 years or 50 years, but there's kind of a qualitative shift that takes place when we're thinking of a century.
Of course, and I mean, that was the provocation also. And I think we should start to think, I mean, it has to do with sustainability, with questions of or even sustainability in terms of economy and ecology, materials, as I said, resources, but also I think it really makes us understand that architecture and design in general, but perhaps also buildings, they still relate to a different dimension of time than so many other things in our society. And this is a drama, this is great, but it's also an anxiety. I mean, it's also something we probably don't know how to deal with. And speaking about that, I think it's very interesting. I want all of us to understand that this is what we're doing. We are conceiving something physical that is meant to last longer than we live, whether it's 100 years or 20, 25 years. I mean, that's then secondary. And in that sense, also the Lindt building, yes. I said in the very beginning, or I tried to describe the building as a primary, almost archaic type of an atrium. We can relate it to ancient Rome or to department stores of the beginning of the 20th century. So it is specific, yes. It even tries to celebrate the presence of architecture for the very reason that it is sort of coming after the actual industrial production, so it has its own, it lives on its own right. But it also should be open enough to change. It can be transformed into a real factory, or it could be, I don't know, an office or a workshop building. Hopefully. I still believe that. It's a bit naive, but I think that's an interesting thing. Designers and architects have to sort of keep a certain naivete about these things. Yeah. Yeah?
And how do you incorporate that way of thinking within your design process? I mean, you've spoken about, so does it have to do with, let's say, the way that certain details are made? Does it have to do with the proportions of spaces? Does it have to do with the materials that are used?
Yes, too. I mean, the robustness of the base build of that building is telling about, or is maybe an expression of that ambition of something that can stand. If you look at the pictures of this very sculptural and strong structure, I think it's trying to show a hierarchical understanding of a building. That's what lasts. And then there will be many, many other things, and they will be added, that's now under construction and will be changed, etc. So that's one thing, the material. And the other one, you mentioned it as well, is the space. It's the dimension itself. I think a building that can, let's say, also stand the change of time and live for generations, it needs a certain generosity. I mean, this is banal, and this is just if you take a kid's or a teenager's clothes or suit, or I mean, you grow, no, and it has to be. You cannot. It has to be tailor-made, but it has to be also generous. I mean, like 19th century architecture in a way, no. And another thing, if I may, is how do we do that? To what extent, that was your question, is this ambition or this understanding of architecture related to a long time span? How is it informing our design process? I think there's another two things I would like to mention, and one is that we try to create a specific relationship with the place where the building stands. Not that the place is not changing over time, but still, if there is a sort of an anchorage in the place, that there is a relationship with other buildings or other elements, even the topography and others, I think a building would also keep its credibility and sort of its rightness in a place because of that. And the second one is, and that's a more theoretical speculation, is that probably a building reaches a good age when it is able to relate back to precedents, to references in history. What I'm trying to say is a building that is conceived now under the specific conditions of now and here, but if the building at the same time has a sort of a relationship with buildings that existed before that, it might, and it is tries to reinterpret or to take that further. I'm referring to the atrium, for instance. I'm referring to a sense of orientation in space, of which I believe it's something that could be to a certain extent timeless. Then I have hope or good reason to believe that, and this is a speculation, that the building, because it refers to these primary principles of space and architecture, that it will still work well in the future. Was that kind of logical?
I think, yeah.
Totally.
And adding some speculation and coming back to the question of museum, or whether the Lindt Center, Chocolate Center, is a museum. I'm wondering whether in a time of accelerated cultural tourism, where people since decades go to Bilbao just to see a museum, what is then a chocolate museum, and what's the role of architecture here? It's interesting to me to see, of course, Bilbao, you would see human artifacts, as you would see in the Louvre or other museums that you would travel to. Here in Switzerland, in your project, you would see chocolate. And this, now being at Art Basel, I think this might be surprising. Chocolate sounds maybe a bit banal, but of course it isn't. We also know from UNESCO that there are all sorts of items that are non-artifacts, not typical museum artifacts, are now part of the list, or like intangible heritage, whether it's folk songs, but also food, like Roquefort cheese and maybe also chocolate, I'm not sure whether chocolate's already on the UNESCO list. Otherwise, if they're not, it should Switzerland should make a step forward. But I'm wondering where architecture sits here, so that maybe in the future we will see many more, also a kind of broadening of the idea of art and culture, which would incredibly inclusive, maybe also terrible that everything will be branded and will be part of an official heritage title. Where would you see your project here as a speculation and also as a maybe a symptom of this very global Switzerland also, which is also a very global brand to a certain extent?
I think this is a very, very interesting aspect of the project, and on the very general question at the same. I see a sense of convergence where everything tends to become in a way a bit the same. No, that's like one tendency. It's not the only one, but so if it's whether it's chocolate or, by the way, wine, winery is a big thing, and indeed it has to do with culture. So in that sense, true, and it's very much related to the human experience, the human body, your experience in the everyday. But if you then go to art fairs or to museums, I mean, when I speak of convergence in the sense of things becoming more and more the same, I might speculate. This is a slightly cynical. I don't mean it bitter or nasty, but I mean, perhaps that chocolate center is the ultimate art experience. You know, at least there are tendencies which I do not necessarily share, but I think in that sense, yes, we could see this particular work in a straight continuity to other operations in the museum world. I mean, there's much more sophisticated, given the product is the artwork, but I mean, Lafayette doing in a place of experiment and production and speculating about an experience where I see things being produced and I'm a spectator, I'm a visitor, but I'm also maybe part of it. I think this is very interesting. And that's a very general, a very generous also tendency in the art world. And it opens up to food, and we can go to receptions where artists are, I mean, offering sausages, you know, in front of their artwork, and this is of course a social activity, and it's also nice. So sometimes, but I find it also a bit scary. Is everything becoming the same, and is the chocolate factory, museum / production plant, cafe, the ultimate place of culture? At the same time, I don't hope so, you know. I'm really also quite ambivalent because the Kunstmuseum, for instance, is a totally different thing. The Kunstmuseum is in that sense a very old-fashioned place that can become again super hot now in the 21st century because art is all over the place. We have it with us in our pockets everywhere. So maybe it's right to create these kind of encapsulated spaces where you have almost surprisingly intense and a bit out of time experience where you have this immediate interaction between an artwork in its traditional format, perhaps, and you as a spectator, as a viewer, and that's a different tendency. And I think there are different models.